15.
It's a bit odd to be up here after having listened for 2.5 years to so many amazing people, but it's very nice. What happened 40 years ago happened 40 years ago tomorrow, the 19th of June, I think I'm right, Marsha, when Marsha Rowe, who's sitting right here in front of me, and I were the co-founders of a magazine called Spare Rib, and from Spare Rib there was also then Virago Publishing, which Marsha and I started with Carmen, who is sitting next to Marsha. So it's kind of nice that we're all here in the same room and still friends. But when I was trying to think about how to tell the story of Spare Rib, it's Marsha's and mine's story for one thing, and also I found myself going backwards all the time to try to find out how we got to where we got to 40 years ago tomorrow. And so this story is going to start somewhere slightly different, and it's my version of how I got to be Marsha's partner on that wonderful day, midsummer, when this funny little magazine began, which was, in fact, I'll just say it now, was named by Claude Coburn when Marsha and I were in a Chinese restaurant with him just off the Fulham Road, and he held up a Spare Rib and said, "This is what you should call it." And to start with, I certainly couldn't see that it was a good name, but it was a genius thing to do. But to start about 1.5 years before that, I was reading pure maths at Kent University, and it was not going anywhere. My father had given me a blue Hillman for Christmas, and as a reward for getting into university. And I got in the Hillman one night, and I thought, sod it, I'm going to London. And I went to London, and I lived in the car for 3 weeks, and we were parked in the Gloucester Road. And then one day I came back, and the car wasn't there. So I moved in. It had been towed away. It wasn't stolen. It lived for many more days after that. And I moved into a flat in a basement, which was owned by a girl called Georgina, who came from the Shires. And she supplemented her father's allowance by visiting Arabs in Park Lane, who she swore to me she didn't sleep with, but she always came back with cash. She had a very, very... They do bear a relevance to this story, these Arabs, as you will see in a few minutes. But I moved in onto the sofa. And this state of affairs carried on for another few weeks, and during the days I didn't really do very much. I hadn't told my father. I was really too scared to say that I'd left university, and I didn't have anything to do, and I didn't know what to do. But anyway, Salvation appeared one night, very late, about 11:30. I was on my sofa facing another night, wondering what to do, and the doorbell rang. And it was Georgina's sort of part-time, rather untogether, Oxford graduate drug dealer. And he lived in a flat round the corner, and he had been locked out. Can I have the first picture? Now, over there, on the very far side, is the said Oxford graduate, part-time drug dealer, now England's probably most famous lexicographer, Jonathan Green, also Daisy's godfather, as Carmen is her godmother, and indeed one more godmother in the room too. Jonathan had a job on Rolling Stone magazine, and as the night went by, and we imbibed in a few joints, and he told me these stories, and I thought, oh my God, this just sounds wonderful. Anyway, I moved in a couple of days later. He got his keys back finally to his flat, and I came along as well. And he got me a job on a magazine called Friends. At that point, it had just gone bankrupt, and so it has restarted as FRENDZ, which was a extraordinary sort of publication. And Marsha, who I didn't know at this point, but Marsha was not many streets away, probably about 4 or 5, just off Holland Park, working on a magazine called Oz. And there were a lot of interesting, clever, good young women at this point, all working on the underground press. And the thing about the underground press was that it had been set up to be alternative. It was about a counterculture. I mean, I look back on it, it wasn't really about anything strictly political. But for a very brief period, all sorts of different people got together, whether they were about feminism, or whether they were about Marxism, or whether they were about Maoism, or whether they were about being a hippie, or taking drugs, or living in a commune, or whatever, or eating vegetarian food, whatever it happens to be, you sort of coalesced into this extraordinary life. And so on the underground press, we wrote about this, we wrote about, as I say, we wrote about communes, we wrote about the beginning of Glastonbury, we wrote about Northern Ireland, we wrote about political prisoners. It all sort of higgledy-piggledy. And I turned up, and it was summer, and I hadn't been there very long, like 2 or 3 days. I didn't know much what was going on, but it had a strange cycle, the magazine, that everyone would get completely exhausted putting it out, and then they had to sleep for a week to get better. That was also to do with the incredible consumption of various substances. And it was during one of these sleeping weeks, and I was there, and we got this call, which was to say that John Lennon and Yoko Ono were prepared to be interviewed in the Apple headquarters in Savile Row, and would someone go? The someone turned out to be me, because there was no one else to go. And I had this very, very large tape recorder. It was about like this. And I set off to Savile Row thinking, I don't know what to ask them. I spent the entire interview absolutely paralyzed with fear that the tape recorder would break, which it didn't. But I can't remember anything else, except that it was about Yoko's book called Grapefruit. And a few weeks later, I got a letter from them, and it said, from the stateroom of Mr. and Mrs. John Lennon on the QE2, saying, thank you very much for the interview, and pointing out a spelling mistake that I'd made. And I kept this letter, and I have to confess now, but there's a moral in this, that I did finally sell it when I was incredibly broke, and I got 850 quid at Sotheby's. It wasn't worth a penny. I wish I had it now. Curiously, because I'm going to go and see Yoko's art exhibition tomorrow for something I have to do. So we had very many adventures there. There were one, my friend on the magazine was called Pat, and she had a baby in a lavatory in her school in Birmingham when she was 13. She swore she didn't know she was pregnant until the baby appeared. And one day, Pat and I were sitting there wondering what to do, and this person arrived, and he said, I want to be your slave. And I kid you not, for the next fortnight, this man cleaned the stairs and the lavatory stark naked, and then he vanished. This was it. Another day, we had an extraordinary character called Daphne, who came lugging up the stairs carrying a bed springs, rusty. And she said, if I pay you, can I sleep in the office on the bed springs with no clothes on? So we said, what, great, you know, because we had no money at all. She gave us £500 for this. That was a lot of money in those days. There were some serious people there, like Hakim Jamal and Michael X, and they were serious and scary. They represented the Black Power movements. We also had the Oz trial going on at that point, because Jonathan became the editor of Oz after Richard Neville and Felix Dennis and Jim Anderson were sent to prison. Even though they only went to prison for 3 days, they were then stopped from working on the magazine. Jonathan and I stayed up many nights making an effigy of Judge Argyll, which we then carried on the tube to the Old Bailey, where we set it on fire. It was a great day. But seriously, what was going on with women? And what was going on with women was that we were meant to be alternative too. We were meant to be available for sex whenever the men liked. But at the same time, we were also meant to be the secretaries. I was not really a secretary because I couldn't type. But I mean, I did drive the things here. I had one of the few people with a car, so I had endless kind of just journeys and stuff to do. And what happened at Friends was in the November of 40 years ago last year, a woman called Angie Weir appeared in the office one day, and she said, I think you ought to do a women's issue. And she rustled this up with us, and we did quite a lot of stories about equal pay, about childcare, about abortion, about the things that people were beginning to get very concerned and starting to talk about. Because the female eunuch had come out, there'd been a big conference in Oxford of women, and it wasn't just that people were looking at where the laws were wrong, but the fact that there were very few women in the professions, that women were dropping out of education. It was also about the fact that we were just meant to be wives and mothers. There didn't seem to be a future. We didn't have a voice. We were just chattels. And it's hard now, sitting here in this room with lots of women who are in their 20s and 30s, to remember that, do you know, you couldn't get a mortgage if you were a woman 40 years ago. You had to have that signed by your father or your husband. You weren't allowed to rent a car without those things. It was extraordinary. We were in a kind of women's dark ages. Anyway, we did a women's issue, and it was at the same time that I heard that Marsha and her friend Louise, who had come over with, Louise was Richard Neville's girlfriend, Richard Neville of Oz, and they had actually got together and done something. And the something that they did was they set up meetings of women in the underground press. And I heard about this, and I went along. And I was completely blown away by what I'd done, blown away by what I heard, because I suppose a lot of what I saw at that point, and I was just coming up for 21, I could see my mother in my eyes, and my mother, who was a clever and wonderful and beautiful person, who was also sad and miserable and who didn't do anything. And I thought, I don't quite know what I want to be, but I don't want to be that. And Marsha and I knew that one thing that we could do was create magazines. And so we sat down during the miners' strike, candlelight most nights, and we started to write a manifesto about spare rib. And we had very high ideals, I think it's fair to say, that there was a great feeling that actually the trap that women were in, which was to be just I say just, to be a mother and to stay at home and to not work was actually just as bad of a gender trap as it was to be a man who had to say, I'm going to go out to work from the age of 20 till 65 and I'm going to support my 2.2 children, and that's what I am stuck in as well. And that if we did this magazine, if we started to publish something that looked at all the different things that could happen and the different ways we could be, that what would happen was that actually this would be an extraordinary freedom for everybody. Of course, I think you have to start anything with high ideals as though it's all going to be okay. And indeed, lots of things did happen. Can we have the first issue of Spare Rib, by the way? This is the issue that came out 40 years ago. And these were two friends of ours, whose names I have to say I've forgotten. You can probably remember. But we wanted to show people who looked just young and full of life. So can you scroll on, Alex? This was Christmas, and actually, John Cleese recreated this for Esquire for me in the 90s. Keep going. She was Jimi Hendrix's girlfriend, and very beautiful, troubled and lovely. We cast around, the idea of Spare Rib was that also it wasn't going to look like an underground paper, i.e. it wasn't going to look like something from a hippie sense. It was going to be very much in contrast to Woman and Woman's Own, which at that point were both selling around about 1.3 million copies a week. And the absolute message was in their fiction. And their fiction always ended with the lines, and they got married and lived happily ever after. And nothing ever happened after the altar. And even though neither Marsha or I were married and had children, we had a really big hunch that things weren't necessarily absolutely fantastic after the altar. So it was a little magazine that sold 20,000 copies. It lived for 20 years. I was not there for very long. I fell in love and ran away to India. Marsha stayed with it for another 8 years and was its proper editor and director. And Carmen and Marsha and I started Virago. And that was something that Carmen took on, and it became a huge and successful thing. But I think that the expression, a magazine that punched above its weight, could have been made for Spare Rib, because even though it didn't sell shed loads, it really played a massive part in transforming the way that women live and the way that we've all been, and it was just one of the best things in my life. So we just wanted to show that. Thank you.